All right, guys, so in the previous video, we led up to this discussion of what was going to be the lab standard, or at least a part of the lab standard that we're going to discuss in this section of the module. And we said the lab standard is important and it was implemented because we fully understand now that laboratories have their own worries that's different than maybe the production and the manufacturing side. So the lab standard, before we go into more detail, is what we call a performance standard. So what we mean when we say this is that OSHA will come in and say, yes, we are going to enforce the lab standard. And these are the things that we want you to worry with. But they will not tell you specifically how to prevent the exposure. They allow the employers to make this decision on their own. And you're probably wondering, well, why? Because it looks like some employers would take this more seriously than others, and they do. Don't get that wrong, they do. Some employers take this very seriously, and they have detailed plans in existence. Other employers probably will just briefly skim these standards, and that's about it. But the reason that OSHA did not want to go in and regulate the same thing for everyone is that that doesn't quite work out. Laboratories are all different, right? So for instance, if you are a laboratory on site and the only thing that you do is test sulfuric acid for purity, then you have very limited reagents, you have a limited lab space, you might not have a lot of employees, but that is going to be completely different than a lab space maybe at a pharmaceutical company, where we could have hundreds of employees, and those employees are all working in laboratories doing multiple things, and you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of chemicals on site. OSHA could not step in and mandate certain things that would be uniform throughout the entire lab gambit. Depending on where you're working and what you're doing and what you're testing, all labs have different needs. Okay? And OSHA understands that. So that's why they say, we are not going to tell you how to do it. We're just going to say, these are the things that we would like for you to include. Just make sure that you include them. And in some of your cases, you might not have specific details on these sections, and that's okay. You just need to let us know. In other cases, you might want to put significant amounts of details in these, and that's okay too. You need to use this template, which is what it is, at your discretion. The areas that need to be beefed up, that apply specifically to you, that is what we'll look for. If this area does not apply to you, then you leave it blank with maybe a sentence that just says not applicable, right? That is what OSHA's after. So what's one thing that's included in this lab standard that we're going to be talking about in this module? And this is called a chemical hygiene plan. This is a perfect example where OSHA provides regulations, but not how to do them. So a chemical hygiene plan, a CHP, is basically a safety plan. OSHA requires it of any laboratory. All organizations have to have one, right? A lot of times we see academics being an exception. Academic laboratories don't have to do this. Academic labs don't have to do that. But academic labs at a community college, even at a high school, if they have a lab space, they should have a chemical hygiene plan in place. All right? So all organizations, even academic institutions of all areas, have to have a chemical hygiene plan, which is basically a safety plan. The person that writes this is typically called a chemical hygiene officer, and we abbreviate that as a CHO, and the CEO of a company, or really a president of a college, or a department chair, or a principal, someone is held responsible to make sure that these are done. So, for instance, if I have a chemistry laboratory, that chemistry lab is probably part of a larger science department. The science department should have a chemical hygiene plan in place. If they do not have a chemical hygiene plan, then the department chair or whoever is over that science department, like a dean, or maybe it goes all the way up to a vice president or the president of the school, depending on how serious this is, would be held ultimately responsible for this document. In addition to that, I know we keep saying institutions, academic institutions, students are not covered in the chemical hygiene plan. That is not the purpose of a CHP. They don't care about you. Again, you are not an employee. You are paying to take a class in a laboratory setting. You are not an employee. You do not get a paycheck. This falls under OSHA, occupational safety. All they care about is the worker. So, I, as an employee of the college, would fall under the chemical hygiene plan. A work-study student that would be working in my lab space would fall under the chemical hygiene plan because they're getting paid to do a job in the laboratory. You, however, as a student, would not be covered under the chemical hygiene plan at all. Only employees are. Again, that's kind of scary. That kind of makes you think about, well, shouldn't parameters be in place that make sure that students are safe and that students are getting exposed as least as possible to chemicals, and that students are receiving the proper safety training? And the answer is yeah. And some people push for that, but right now there's nothing in place for that. Okay? So in the next video, we're going to continue on with the discussion of a chemical hygiene plan. We now know it's a safety plan. We now know that all organizations need to have one. We know that the person in charge of the chemical hygiene plan is called the chemical hygiene officer, and that bigwigs, CEOs and presidents, could be held responsible if the institutional organization does not have a CHP plan in place. Okay? All right, so in the next video, we'll pick up from here and we'll continue on.